My name is Laura, and I am 22 years old. I arrived in this foreign city just a few weeks ago, carrying with me a small suitcase packed with essentials and a heart full of cautious hope. The streets here are unfamiliar, lined with buildings whose facades wear the patina of time, whispering stories I cannot yet understand. Every morning, I step outside my modest apartment and am greeted by the cool air that carries scents of rain, concrete, and distant wood smoke. I came here to study, to build a future from scratch far away from the life I once knew. The university is a sprawling complex of stone and glass, bustling with students who move with purpose and familiarity. I watch them from a distance as I navigate my own path between lecture halls and the crowded cafeteria. The language barrier is a quiet wall, but I break through it slowly, word by word, day by day. Money is a constant shadow at my side. I brought a fixed sum from home, enough for the essentials if I am careful. Every purchase is measured, weighed, against necessity. Bread, vegetables, simple clothes, luxuries are a forgotten language. I have never been one to indulge easily. Frugality has been a habit etched into my very being long before I came here. Yet now, every cent carries the weight of survival, every expense a decision that ripples beyond the moment. The apartment where I live is small and plain, the walls thin enough to hear neighbors' quiet conversations through the night. A single window looks out over the busy street below, where cars and pedestrians weave a constant tapestry of motion. At night, the city lights flicker like distant stars, casting long shadows that stretch into my room and blend with the soft hum of life outside. One constant in this unsettled existence is Alex. We have known each other for months, a connection born before my arrival, rooted in late-night conversations and shared dreams of opportunity. He is a fellow international student, his eyes bright with ambition, his smile a reminder of the promise of better days. Together, we navigate this strange city, our hopes intertwined like threads in a fragile tapestry. Alex mentioned to me one evening about a side job he found online. It seemed simple enough, writing reviews for hotels on a website called Elite Concierge. The promise was modest but enticing, a small payment for honest opinions. I was cautious but supportive, admiring his initiative in finding a way to earn extra money in a world that often feels unyielding. In the first week, he earned about €80, a small but welcome addition to our tight budget. It felt like a breath of fresh air, a glimpse of possibility. But beneath the surface, something began to shift, an unease that whispered in the corners of my mind. Though I pushed it aside, unwilling to let fear cloud the fragile hope, then came the news. That changed everything. Alex told me the job required a deposit, a sum of money paid upfront before earnings could be withdrawn. The amount was far greater than I anticipated, and it sent a ripple of alarm through me. This detail had been kept quiet, a shadow lurking behind the promise of easy money. Over the following weeks, the deposits increased, each one larger and more daunting than the last. We used the money I had brought from home, the careful savings meant to see me through months of study and survival. I lent him what I could, paying parts of his rent and the growing deposits while still managing our daily expenses. The balance was precarious, a delicate dance on the edge of disaster. The website changed its address multiple times, an unsettling sign of instability. Customer support was elusive, a man on Telegram who replied with automated-sounding messages that failed to inspire confidence. Payments were sent to scattered accounts, sometimes through cryptocurrency, leaving a trail that vanished like smoke. Despite the growing alarm, Alex held onto hope, convinced that the money would come back, that the deposits were investments to unlock a greater return. We borrowed from friends and family, drained our accounts, and watched as our security slipped through our fingers. When Alex finally tried to withdraw the full sum, a new obstacle appeared: a security deposit equal to half the amount requested. The website's shifting rules and demands became a labyrinth designed to trap rather than reward. We paid the exorbitant fees, holding fast to the hope of reclaiming what was ours, but hope turned to despair when a new penalty was demanded, a late fee, justified by vague threats of account suspension and further complications. It was clear now that this was no legitimate opportunity but a carefully crafted scam, a trap with no exit. The money was gone. Our future, once painted in bright colors, was now a canvas smeared with uncertainty and loss. I filed reports with the police and crime agencies, contacted payment platforms, and waited for justice that seemed as distant as the city's farthest horizon. Through it all, I carried the cold weight of betrayal and the aching knowledge that my careful nature and hard work had not been enough to shield me. The path ahead was dark and uncertain, but I refused to let this chapter be the end of my story. The days following the first large deposit blurred together in a haze of anxiety and exhaustion. Each morning, I awoke with a tightening in my chest, a silent dread that grew heavier as I tried to focus on the life around me, the routine of classes, the hum of the city streets, and the occasional smile from a passing stranger. But beneath the surface, a storm raged, fueled by the mounting sums of money vanishing into the unknown. Alex's phone became a permanent fixture in his hand, his eyes scanning messages and updates from the elusive customer support. The words he read were always cautiously hopeful, promising progress but demanding more payments, more deposits, as if the next step was always just out of reach. I watched him transform before me from the confident young man I had known into someone shadowed by doubt and desperation. The apartment grew colder, not just from the dropping temperatures but from the unspoken tension that settled like a thick fog. Our conversations became sparse, filled with silences heavier than words. I carried the weight of our dwindling funds carefully, rationing every euro with precision, juggling rent, food, and the mounting demands from the scam. The savings I had brought were slipping through my fingers like sand, and each empty balance filled me with quiet panic. I found myself withdrawing from friends, ashamed of the situation and unwilling to explain the tangled web of deceit that had ensnared us. Loneliness wrapped around me tightly, a constant companion in the dark hours of the night. I clung to the smallest comforts: a cup of warm tea, the pages of a well-worn book, and the soft hum of music that reminded me of home. At university, I forced myself to focus on my studies, but the distraction was relentless. My mind drifted to unpaid bills, to the vague promises from the scam site, and to the growing pile of debts that threatened to overwhelm us. The future I had imagined seemed to recede further with each passing day, replaced by a reality marked by loss and uncertainty. Despite my fears, Alex refused to give up. His hope was stubborn, a fragile thread that he clung to with quiet desperation. He believed that if we could just meet the next demand, the entire sum would be released and everything would be made right. I wanted to share in his hope, but the growing evidence of deceit gnawed at me relentlessly. The website changed addresses again, a red flag that I could no longer ignore. Customer support remained evasive, their messages cold and scripted. Payments were sent to scattered, untraceable accounts, sometimes through cryptocurrency, slipping through our grasp like shadows. When the next demand arrived, a security deposit so large it drained our last reserves, I felt a breaking point approach. Friends and family were tapped out, our bank accounts overdrawn, and the weight of desperation pressed down like an unbearable burden. The promises of easy returns felt like cruel lies, the scam a trap that tightened with every euro we paid. One night, I sat alone in the dim light of our apartment, the silence around me broken only by the distant sounds of the city. I thought of the life I had left behind, of the dreams that had brought me here, and of the fragile hope that still flickered in the darkness. I knew the road ahead would be long and painful, but surrender was not an option. I vowed to fight, to find a way out of the shadows, even if the path was uncertain and the cost was high. The story was far from over, and I was determined to write the next chapter on my own terms. The days stretched on, each one blending into the next like waves in an endless sea, carrying with them the heavy silence that had settled over our lives. The small apartment we shared felt increasingly like a prison, its walls closing in with every passing hour, enclosing us in a space where hope was both fragile and scarce. I moved through the rooms with mechanical precision, performing tasks without thought, preparing meals from the barest ingredients, washing the same clothes, and staring out the window at the city that continued its relentless pace without me. Alex's presence was both constant and distant, a paradox that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. He sat for hours scrolling through his phone, eyes glazed, searching for answers and messages from accounts that shifted like ghosts. His voice, once warm and animated, had been replaced by a quiet resignation that spoke volumes in its absence. The hope he clung to was a thin thread stretched tight between us, fraying with every new demand from the elusive website. The money we had poured into the scam vanished without a trace, disappearing into a labyrinth of accounts that seemed designed to confuse and mislead. The deposits, once manageable, became staggering sums that swallowed our savings and drained any reserves we had managed to maintain. I became acutely aware of every euro spent or lent, tracking expenses with a meticulousness born of desperation. The numbers told a story of loss that no one around me could see, a silent tragedy unfolding beneath the surface of everyday life. Outside, the world continued unabated. Neighbors laughed and argued, children played in the street, and the seasons shifted in their steady rhythm, indifferent to the turmoil within our walls. I envied their freedom, the simple certainty of a life not bound by invisible chains. My own future felt obscured by a dense fog, each step forward uncertain and fraught with peril. Sleep became elusive, the nights filled with restless thoughts and the cold grip of anxiety. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining 1,000 scenarios, some hopeful, most terrifying. The weight of what we had lost pressed down relentlessly, but beneath it all, a flicker of resolve remained. I would not let this be the end. I sought answers in quiet corners of the internet, reading stories of others ensnared in similar traps. Their experiences mirrored my own, the promises, the deposits, the endless string of obstacles that kept money just out of reach. Knowing I was not alone offered a bittersweet comfort, a reminder that this darkness was not unique but still profoundly isolating. I reached out to authorities, filed reports with trembling hands, hoping for intervention or at least acknowledgement. The process was slow and often discouraging, with bureaucratic walls rising between me and justice. Payment platforms blocked suspicious accounts, but the scamsters simply shifted their tactics, moving to new channels and new identities. It was a game of shadows and mirrors, and we were left chasing ghosts. Amid this bleak landscape, moments of clarity and strength emerged. I focused on my studies, immersing myself in books and research as a lifeline to a future beyond this nightmare. Each page turned was a small victory, a reminder that my story was not yet written in despair. I made plans, tentative and fragile, for what could come after the storm. The relationship with Alex grew strained, a fragile bridge creaking under the weight of unspoken fears and fading trust. Yet, in this silence, I found a deepening understanding of my own resilience and the need to stand firm for myself, even if it meant walking parts of this journey alone. The road ahead was uncertain, shadowed by doubt and the lingering threat of loss, but it was also mine to claim. With each breath, each step, I reclaimed a small piece of my strength, preparing to face whatever lay beyond the horizon. Time passed, but nothing truly moved forward. The days, though longer now with the early whispers of summer in the air, remained heavy with uncertainty and invisible weight. I often wondered how the world could remain so indifferent. The buses still came and went. The cafes opened their doors to chattering students. The air smelled faintly of fresh flowers and car exhaust while I drifted through it all like a ghost caught in someone else's life. My studies continued, though my connection to them felt increasingly tenuous. I attended lectures, took notes, and submitted essays, but I moved through the motions as if watching someone else do it. There were moments in class when a professor would say something, a theory, a metaphor, an idea, and my mind would cling to it, only for the thought to slip through my fingers like sand. Concentration was a luxury I could no longer afford. My mind was occupied with numbers, missing funds, unanswered messages, and the growing fear that I had sacrificed everything for a lie. I began to feel the edges of myself wearing down. The once sharp lines of who I was, organized, careful, independent, blurred into something softer, more brittle. I found it harder to look in mirrors. I no longer recognized my own expression. A fixed, polite smile in public, hollow eyes when alone, and a tiredness that no amount of sleep could cure. Alex had stopped speaking about the scam altogether. Not because it was over, but because there was nothing left to say. The last payment we had sent, a laughable sum we scraped together after borrowing from an old acquaintance of his, had, like the rest, disappeared into silence. No confirmation, no access to the promised funds, no answers. It was as if we had paid a fee to vanish our own money from existence, yet even then, a part of him seemed to hold on to hope, or maybe it was denial. He would check the website in the morning, scroll through vague updates, and mention new terms he had read and new steps he thought might help. I nodded, not in agreement, but because I had no more energy to argue. In truth, I had stopped believing in recovery. I no longer expected anything to return. My only goal had become survival. At night, when the silence became suffocating, I walked, sometimes for half an hour, sometimes longer, tracing the same streets past shuttered shops and flickering lamplights. I didn't have a destination. I only needed to feel the air on my skin, to move, to not be surrounded by the four walls of our suffocating apartment. I watched windows in apartment blocks and imagined the lives inside. I imagined people reading, cooking, laughing, people with routines untouched by betrayal and loss. I rarely spoke to anyone anymore. Friends from school reached out at first, kind messages, casual check-ins, invitations, but I let most of them go unanswered. I didn't know how to explain my silence. What could I say? That I had given everything I had to someone I trusted, and it had all vanished into digital mist? That the person I shared a home with barely spoke to me now, and that every waking hour was tainted by regret? It felt easier to drift further into isolation. Groceries became simpler each week. I bought the same things over and over: bread, eggs, lentils, and apples. I skipped coffee and sweets and ignored the small luxuries that used to bring moments of comfort. There was no room for indulgence, only function. I cooked and ate quietly, mostly in silence, while Alex stared at his screen or disappeared into other rooms. I started reading more, not out of joy, but as an escape. I chose old novels from the university library, worn with age and forgotten by most. I didn't always understand the stories, but I clung to their language, their rhythm, and their sense of time passing with purpose. Unlike my life, which felt as though it had frozen in place, eventually, I found myself researching scams. Not idly, not out of curiosity, but with urgency. I wanted to understand how something like this could be so thorough, so believable, so devastating. I read about similar platforms, about fraud rings operating across continents, and about people who had lost more than we had: their houses, their families, and even their sense of reality. The scale of it both horrified and comforted me. We weren't alone, but we were still trapped. I submitted documents to digital fraud agencies, filled out forms in English and translated versions into the local language, and attached screenshots and bank records and timelines. I sent emails to institutions that never responded. I filed follow-ups and heard nothing. I stared at blank inboxes and logged out, each time a little more resigned to the fact that the system moved slowly, if at all, and still, the days went on, one after another, endlessly, but something inside me was changing slowly, subtly. The grief and shame, though still present, were beginning to harden into something else. Not bitterness, not yet, but clarity. A quiet, emerging sense that if I wanted to move forward, I would have to let go of the version of the story where we won something back. That ending no longer existed. There would be no clean resolution, only survival, and whatever came after it. The calendar on the wall remained unchanged, as though time itself had chosen to stop acknowledging our existence. The paper edges curled slightly, yellowed from the pale sunlight that filtered in through the dusty window pane. I glanced at the date often, not to mark the days but as a form of proof that I was still here, still moving forward even if the world around me had stilled. Money had become a language of its own. It spoke through every decision and whispered through every purchase I no longer made, every item I passed over in the store. It lingered like a question in the back of my mind each time I turned on a light or filled a pot with water to boil rice. Even the silence in our apartment felt shaped by it, heavy, constant, unforgiving. I had stopped expecting change. There were no new developments, no new emails, no miraculous messages, just the dull echo of all the ones before. The messages from the fake customer support had long since dried up, their last excuse delivered with artificial formality. After that, nothing, as if we had been erased from their world, our usefulness expended. I noticed small things more now. The way the floorboards creaked differently when I walked barefoot. The sound of Alex's chair scraping across the tiles when he sat down at his desk. The distant hum of the tram that passed by twice every hour. These were the rhythms I clung to, mechanical, predictable, and strangely comforting in a life otherwise devoid of certainty. My body moved through its own routines. I woke early, sometimes without having really slept. I washed the dishes even when there were only a few. I cleaned the bathroom not because it needed it, but because I needed something to control. I arranged the books on my desk in order of size and color. I folded clothes with precision. These tasks became small victories, tangible in a world where almost everything else had slipped from my grasp. Alex had changed. He barely looked me in the eye anymore. He ate less, slept more, and avoided long stretches of silence with the dull hum of videos playing from his phone. We existed beside each other but no longer with each other. Words between us became practical. Short updates about bills, reminders about rent, and occasional confirmations of class schedules. There was no anger, just quiet distance built day by day like layers of dust on unused shelves. Outside the apartment, I became invisible. I walked to the store, to class, and to the library. I nodded politely to people and exchanged brief pleasantries when necessary, but I never allowed real connection. I feared what I might say if someone looked too closely. I feared the flood of truth behind the stillness I wore like armor. There was a moment one afternoon when I sat on a park bench after class, watching a group of children chase each other through patches of sun-dappled grass. Their laughter floated through the air, unaffected, unburdened. I envied them, not because they were young, but because they moved through life with nothing to lose. I remembered a version of myself who had once believed that careful planning and hard work could protect against disaster. That version felt far away now, almost imaginary. The refund requests we had submitted to our payment providers were now mere documents in a forgotten folder on my laptop. The fraud reports we had filed had not been followed up on. There were no calls, no updates, just silence. I checked them less and less often, already knowing what I would find, but I didn't give up. Not entirely. Something in me refused to. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or something deeper, a refusal to let this be the end of my story. I began documenting everything, not for the police, not for justice, but for myself. Every transaction, every message, every change in the scams tactics. I organized them into a file. I wrote everything down: dates, times, the emotional impact, and the decisions made. It gave me a sense of structure and, strangely, a feeling of reclaiming control. I didn't know yet what I would do with this growing document, but it was mine. Not a lie, not a trick, not a promise made to be broken. Just the truth in black and white. A record of what had been done. A record of who I had become. And in that, I began to feel something shift. Not hope, Not yet, but resolve. A quiet, steady commitment to survive, to continue, to rebuild from the wreckage, one piece at a time. The scam had taken our money. It had taken time and energy and trust. But it would not take the rest of me. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and cast long, golden streaks across the stone streets, I found myself sitting alone in a corner of the university library. It was quieter than usual, the tables mostly empty, the soft shuffle of papers and the distant tapping of a keyboard the only sounds that filled the space. I wasn't studying. I had opened my notebook but had been staring at the same sentence for almost half an hour, my pen unmoving. My thoughts were elsewhere, drifting again to what had been lost and how quietly it had all vanished. I turned the page absent-mindedly, trying to reset my focus, and that's when I noticed the girl seated 2 tables over. I had seen her once or twice in the hallway, always alone, always quiet. She wore a gray sweater that hung loosely around her frame and had a stack of folders beside her that looked well-worn, with pages sticking out at odd angles. She stood up suddenly, maybe to grab something, and a file from her pile slid off the table and scattered across the floor. Loose papers fluttered in every direction. Without thinking, I got up and helped gather them. When I picked up the nearest sheet, I paused. The header at the top was unmistakable: Elite Concierge. My breath caught just for a second, and something inside me jolted awake. I didn't say anything. I simply handed her the pages. Our eyes met for a second, and she nodded almost absent-mindedly, but her face was tight, like she hadn't smiled in weeks. She returned to her seat, and I went back to mine, heart pounding. I didn't know why this encounter affected me so much, but it did. I couldn't look away. I watched as she slowly reshuffled her papers, most of them covered in printed screenshots, transaction logs, red pen markings, and typed notes in English. She opened her laptop and continued working, but now I couldn't focus on my own page anymore. There, just meters from me, sat someone who had touched the same fire and been burned, someone who had likely felt the same helplessness. I stayed for nearly another hour, turning pages I didn't read, unsure what I was even waiting for. As I packed my things to leave, I passed her table again. This time, I let my eyes fall once more on the corner of one page: 11700 lost, final, payment blocked, crypto wallet unreachable. It was like reading my own story written by someone else's hand. I walked out into the cool evening air, my steps slower than usual. My thoughts spun not in fear or despair, but with something else entirely. For months, I had assumed no one else truly understood the quiet unraveling I had lived through. And yet, here was proof in a gray sweater and a stack of papers that others had lived parallel versions of my pain. That night, back in the apartment, I opened my own records again. But this time, I didn't feel like I was writing in a void. I wasn't sure what it meant yet, or what I would do with that brief encounter. But I felt something stirring, not quite hope, but maybe something adjacent to it. A sense that the wall I had built around myself might not be as impenetrable as I thought. The morning after I saw her in the library, I woke before the alarm. The light outside was dull and gray, the sky hanging low as if trying to press down on the city itself. I lay still for a while, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand why that brief moment, that fleeting recognition of a stranger's suffering had disturbed the numb routine I had grown so used to. There had been something in her eyes, not just exhaustion or pain, but a strange sort of defiance, as if she was holding everything together with sheer will. I hadn't said a word to her, she hadn't spoken to me either, but I felt as though I had seen myself reflected back for the first time in months, and the image had unsettled me more than I expected. My days continued as they had for weeks. I attended classes, sat in the library, walked through the same streets, and past the same shop windows. But something inside me had shifted. I noticed more, I felt more. Where I had once chosen detachment as a survival mechanism, I now felt the slow return of questions. Why had I allowed myself to fall into silence? When had survival become surrender? That evening, I opened the folder where I had kept all the documentation. I hadn't looked at it in days. I had grown tired of the same dates, the same screenshots, and the same sterile evidence of a disaster I had already memorized. But this time, I looked with new eyes, not for closure, not for rescue, but to understand, to prepare. Each entry felt different now. The first deposit, the growing demands, the excuses from the Telegram contact, the sudden changes in the website URL. I could see it all more clearly now. It wasn't just loss. It was a structure, a system, a blueprint of how trust is manipulated, stretched and broken. I didn't feel anger. Not exactly. It was colder than that. Heavier, like a silent refusal to be humiliated further. Like a deep, still decision to no longer remain passive. I kept returning to the memory of her, the girl in the library, with her worn papers and unreadable expression. She hadn't looked afraid. Not anymore. There was weariness, but also something like control. Maybe she was further along than I was. Maybe she had already found a way to reclaim what little she could from the damage. I wondered what she planned to do with all those documents. I wondered if she had spoken to others, if she had shared her story, if she had found someone to listen. The next few days, I went to the library more often than I needed to. I pretended to study. I walked past the tables slowly, not in an obvious way, but enough to scan for her. I didn't even know her name. I wasn't sure what I would say if I saw her again. I just felt that something important had been left unfinished, but she didn't return. At least, not while I was there. I spent longer hours in the common areas on campus, in case I caught a glimpse of her in the crowd. I paid attention now, not just to her, but to everyone. How many other people were carrying the same kind of loss? In silence? How many others sat through lectures while their thoughts spiraled around things they couldn't say out loud? It occurred to me that the real cruelty of what had happened to us wasn't just the stolen money. It was the isolation. The way shame builds walls around you. The way the world moves on without asking why you stopped keeping up. And now, for the first time, I was beginning to think that maybe silence wasn't the only option. At home, Alex barely noticed the change in me. He was still buried in his own fog, his presence in the apartment reduced to vague movements and occasional mutterings as he scrolled through old messages on his phone. He still clung to a sliver of belief that something might reverse itself, that the money might come back, that this might not be the end, but I had stopped believing in rescue. What I wanted now was clarity, action, something that I could do that wasn't just waiting or surviving. I began drafting a new file, a clean one. I wrote out the entire story from the beginning, not just the transactions, but the feelings, the thoughts, and the moments of hesitation. I described how it started, how it escalated, and how it broke us. I didn't embellish. I didn't soften the details. I wanted it to be real. Maybe I would publish it someday. Maybe I would find others. Maybe I would reach out to people like the girl in the library and say I understood. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was standing up, not in public, not loudly, not with certainty, but I was no longer lying flat in the wreckage. I was sitting up, brushing off the dust, looking around. It wasn't hope. It wasn't resolution, but it was a beginning. A week passed before I saw her again. It was late afternoon, the sun already slipping behind the rooftops as I walked down the narrow side street near the faculty library. I wasn't looking for her, not actively, but the sight of her crossing the street ahead of me made my steps slow instinctively. She walked with quiet urgency, her head low, a dark coat pulled tightly around her shoulders, and her same worn gray bag slung across her chest. I followed, not intentionally, just far enough behind to avoid notice. She turned into the side entrance of a nearby campus building, one of the older, quieter ones used mostly for research students. I hesitated, then entered after her. The corridor inside was narrow, the walls lined with outdated bulletin boards and faded timetables. I found her sitting on a bench near a locked seminar room, her folders open on her lap, papers spread across the wooden seat beside her. I walked past her without pausing and sat 2 benches down, close enough to see the outlines of her documents, but far enough not to intrude. I didn't make eye contact. I just sat still, my bag beside me, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Minutes passed. She shifted slightly, organizing a few pages, then reached into her bag and took out a folder. She opened it carefully, like something delicate, and began transferring some documents inside. On the edge of one paper, the familiar title appeared again: Elite Concierge, printed in bold. I knew every word beneath it without having to read. Without thinking, I opened my own bag and pulled out the slim folder I had prepared days earlier. I didn't open it, didn't touch the contents, and just placed it quietly beside me. My fingers rested on the edge of the cover. I remained there, silent, unmoving. She must have noticed. She didn't speak. She didn't look over. But after a long moment, she stood, gathered her things, and walked down the hallway toward the stairwell. I expected her to disappear, but instead, she stopped at the corner and turned slightly. Not fully, just enough to glance in my direction for the first time. Her eyes met mine, just for a second, then she was gone. The next day, I returned to the same bench. She wasn't there. I waited a while, then left. But something had changed. Not in the world around me, but in the space between me and it. The quiet was no longer oppressive. It was now shared. That made it bearable. 2 days later, she sat beside me. I arrived at the hallway earlier than usual, folder in hand, coat still damp from the misty rain outside. She was already there when I turned the corner, sitting at the same bench, her folders on her lap again. Without looking at me, she moved slightly to one side, making space. I sat down beside her. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us gestured. But after a moment, we both opened our folders. She flipped through hers. I adjusted mine. Slowly, we began exchanging documents, 1 page at a time. Screenshots, dates, transactions. Each one matched the same timeline, the same structure, and the same pattern. Her losses were staggeringly similar to mine, different names, different contact numbers, but the same destination, the same empty promises. We didn't need to explain anything. The documents spoke for themselves. Over the next few days, the bench became our meeting point. She brought coffee once and left it between us without a word. I brought printouts and slid them over without comment. We didn't share our names. We didn't need to. We existed in that hallway like survivors on the edge of a battlefield, gathering evidence from the wreckage. I began noticing her habits. She always wore dark colors. She always carried a pen with a red cap. She underlined everything, not emotionally, not frantically, just precisely. Her notes were neat, labeled, and arranged. She had a small USB she carried on a keychain, and once I saw her back it up on one of the faculty computers before erasing her trace completely. There was something methodical in her actions, something practiced. I wondered how long she had been working on her case. I wondered how long she had been alone in it. We didn't speak, but we moved in sync. We stayed long enough to exchange pages, confirm details, and correct each other's records. I found mistakes in my original notes. She noticed contradictions in platform names and dates. Together, the picture sharpened. The fraud became a pattern, a process. One day, she placed a slip of paper on top of my folder. It was not a message, just a list. Names of websites, contact emails, forum links, possibly other victims, possibly legal contacts. I didn't ask. I copied it and returned the paper. That night, I went online and followed every link. I found message boards buried deep under generic titles, posts hidden beneath vague usernames. I recognized the language, the phrases, the fake reviews, and I found other people. People describing the same chain of events. Some had lost less, others more. A few had managed to retrieve small amounts. Most had given up. But the stories were there, raw and unfinished, I created a new folder. I began cataloging their experiences, linking them to mine. I haven't posted anything yet. I just gathered. My world was still small, still quiet, still fragile, but no longer empty. I hadn't healed. The losses remained. The shame had not disappeared, but I was no longer drowning alone in silence, and, for the first time, I didn't feel like a victim, I felt like a witness. The list she had given me grew longer. Each link led to another. Each forum opened a new trail. At first, it felt like navigating a maze with no clear direction, dozens of usernames, fragments of stories, disconnected dates, and broken images. But as I read and cataloged, a rhythm began to emerge. The same phrases were repeated, and the same tactics reappeared. The web was wide, but the hands behind it all seemed strangely consistent. We still met at the same hallway. Nothing changed about our routine. We sat side by side in silence, exchanged pages and printed screenshots, and highlighted corrections. She brought new findings almost every time, URLs I hadn't seen and archived versions of the Elite Concierge website under different names. The domains were constantly shifting, but their designs were eerily similar. They reused the same templates and the same layouts. Only the names and logos differed slightly, as if someone had created dozens of interchangeable masks for the same face. I created a spreadsheet. I began logging the names of every victim I could find on the forums. I included the amounts they had lost, the time frame, the type of contact they had with the fraudsters, and how it had ended. It was overwhelming at first. Some had disappeared after a single post. Others had stayed, offering guidance to newcomers, before drifting into silence. A few had formed small message groups, but they rarely lasted long. The shame clung to them like it clung to me, and yet I continued. Each entry was like a light turned on in a dark room. I was no longer staring at a single wound. I was mapping a crime. She did the same. Her pages became more structured, her notes more detailed. She printed company registries, traced IP addresses, and dug through cached versions of websites. She brought legal terms, financial regulation notes, and references to cross-border crime agencies. There was nothing casual in her work. It was as though she had prepared for this moment her entire life. We didn't speak. We never shared our personal stories, never said how much we had lost or what it had done to us. But we worked like two sides of the same mind. When I forgot a detail, she remembered it. When she missed a connection, I filled it. Together, we reconstructed the outline of something larger than either of us had imagined. The fraud wasn't just one platform. It was an entire ecosystem. Elite Concierge was only one name among dozens, an anchor to a chain of shadowed websites, Telegram accounts, crypto wallets, and shell corporations. The payment routes were fragmented and passed through fake gift card schemes, anonymous payment processors, and international remittance platforms. The design was intentional. It was built to be untraceable. And yet, in small fragments, it began to reveal itself. I found a French user who had lost nearly 15,000 euros. He had posted screenshots identical to mine, same language, same withdrawal delay tactics, same template messages. Another woman in Austria had kept all her transaction records, down to timestamps. I added her data to my spreadsheet. She had lost 9,800 euros. A student in Italy described the same fake customer support using the same Telegram username that had scammed us. And someone from Poland had archived a website that had since vanished, its design a perfect mirror of Elite Concierge. Each post, each record, each message felt like another puzzle piece. We weren't looking for justice anymore. We were building something else, a map, maybe, a memory of what had happened, a monument to truth made from digital dust and fragments. I sent an anonymous message to one of the users. I didn't expect a reply, but 2 days later, I received one. Simple, clear. They had been waiting for someone else to speak. I never mentioned it to her, the girl from the bench. I didn't need to. She saw my updates. She added new connections. Our pages began to overlap, more and more. The documents we exchanged became longer and more complex. We weren't just gathering, we were structuring. I created folders for each alias we had identified, one for every fake site, one for every known victim, one for the visual similarities between each web layout. I began cross-referencing contact numbers, matching Telegram usernames to payment patterns. She compiled jurisdictional law documents related to cross-border financial fraud. Our work was no longer quiet documentation. It had become an investigation. At home, the silence with Alex deepened. He no longer asked questions. I no longer offered answers. We passed each other like strangers. The money was long gone. So was the shared illusion that had once tied us together. I didn't know what he was thinking anymore. I no longer tried to guess, but I knew what I was doing, and for the first time since the first euro was lost, I felt like I had found something that could not be taken from me, not evidence, not closure, but a voice. The messages came slowly at first. A reply one evening from someone in Lisbon, another, days later, from a woman in Prague. Most were brief, a few were guarded, but each one confirmed the same thing, that we were not alone. The spreadsheet now held more than names and numbers. It held connections, traces of people who had lived through the same silent collapse, people who had felt the sting of betrayal disguised as opportunity. Some had lost hundreds, others had lost thousands. A few had kept the pain buried for so long, their words stumbled between fear and relief. We created a shared drive. She set up the structure. I uploaded the files, case by case, screenshot by screenshot. One by one, the outline of the operation we had fallen into began to fill with color. Different names, different borders, same system, same silence. We stopped meeting in the hallway. We began meeting in the old economics building, 3rd floor, abandoned seminar room with no scheduled classes. One large table, 2 chairs, one window looking out over the rooftops. We worked side by side for hours, rarely moving, always writing. She brought her laptop now. I brought folders, hard copies, and notes. I watched her map connections between aliases using color-coded graphs. I traced transaction routes on printed bank records and matched them with timestamps from victims' screenshots. It no longer felt like a secret project. It felt like resistance. Some of the victims we found were hesitant to share, others offered everything they had. They uploaded photos, PDFs, and scan ID requests from the scammers. Some still clung to the hope that money would be returned. Most no longer did, but all of them, in some way, wanted someone to listen. We became the ones who listened. I read through chat logs in languages I didn't understand, piecing together timelines through translation tools and contextual cues. I discovered entire message chains mirroring mine word for word. I saw the same fake customer support signatures, the same scripted reassurances, the same final betrayal. It wasn't just a scam, it was a pattern, a choreography of deception designed to adapt and survive. She began charting the rise and fall of each version of the website. We traced domain registrations, found matching email servers, and even located shared hosting providers across continents. The names changed, but the code remained the same. A stolen template, reused again and again with slight variations. A faceless machine wearing different masks. The room began to fill with documents. Our table overflowed. The windowsill held folders. The floor was lined with printed spreadsheets and paper trails. We didn't clean. We didn't stop. Our work became the only proof that what had happened was real. I started to forget the days. My classes blurred together. My apartment became a place to sleep and charge my laptop. Alex no longer waited for updates. We existed like parallel lives under one roof. He watched videos until morning. I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen, compiling stories that were not mine but could have been. One afternoon, she placed a new file in front of me. Inside was a detailed log of crypto transactions pulled from a public blockchain explorer. She had matched them to known payments from victims. I cross-checked timestamps. It was there. One wallet used repeatedly, linked to over 14 victim reports. Each time the money changed hands, it splintered across new addresses. But the route was visible, traceable, tangible. We saved everything. We backed it up 3 times. One copy on my drive, one on hers, one on an encrypted cloud service neither of us accessed from our personal accounts. We used aliases. We signed with initials. We locked every folder. I stopped feeling afraid. The loss was still real. The betrayal still cut deep, but the silence had been broken. We had turned the echo chamber into a record, and the more we built, the less alone we became. One night, I stayed in the seminar room long after she left. I opened a message from a man in Munich who had sent everything he had, only to be blocked the moment he refused to pay a final bonus fee. His last message ended with a sentence that stayed with me. He had written that silence was the last weapon they used, and we were taking that weapon away from them. Her name was Anna. I found it one morning written in the corner of a document she left behind. A signature, small and faint, printed rather than signed. It was the first time I had seen it. She never said it out loud. I never asked, but the name stayed with me, quiet and solid, like the way she always entered a room without noise, without doubt. We had reached the point where the wall was full. Every inch of space in the seminar room held traces of what we had collected. The folders were stacked in rows, each marked by category. The timeline was complete. The connections mapped. The evidence is undeniable, but it still existed in silence. We hadn't acted yet. Not beyond collecting, organizing, and documenting. We hadn't contacted any authorities since our initial reports. We hadn't approached media. We hadn't created a platform, not because we were afraid, but because we weren't ready to lose control of what we had built. Once it was shared, it would no longer belong to us alone. Anna printed a sheet one afternoon. One page, a proposal, the name of a transnational fraud victims alliance, a legal nonprofit working across borders. One of the forum users had mentioned them briefly. She had traced their outreach email. They had published several investigations before, some even involving similar patterns. Their focus was exposure. I took the paper home. I didn't read it that night. I placed it on my desk beside my laptop and left it untouched. I walked through the apartment slowly, the floor colder than usual under my feet. The light outside was already fading. Alex was in the living room. The screen glowed in front of him. He didn't turn around. His hand rested near his phone. His coffee sat untouched. The air between us was thick with the kind of silence that had grown roots. I sat across from him, but not close. I didn't speak. He didn't move. For a long moment, we simply existed there, together and apart. I looked at him, not with resentment, not with anger, but with the quiet realization of how far we had drifted. He had stopped asking about the money weeks ago. His attention had scattered. Sometimes he played games endlessly. Other nights he searched for new quick income opportunities. I had once watched him scroll past a headline warning about crypto scams. He didn't stop. He didn't read. I stood and walked away. In the seminar room the next morning, Anna was already seated. She had brought new folders. I didn't ask what was inside. She slid them toward me. Inside were formatted summaries, one for each documented victim. Each file was structured as a case brief. Timeline, evidence, amount lost, platform details, proof of payment, screenshots, all anonymized, all aligned. She didn't look at me. When she placed the final sheet beside the pile, a printed letter, a draft, addressed to the organization, explaining our findings, offering to share everything, I nodded. That evening, I read through the letter slowly. Every line felt deliberate. There was no desperation in the words, no plea. It was a report, a reconstruction, a statement of truth from those who had once been silenced. I walked past Alex again that night. He was on a call, low-voiced and distant. I didn't stop. I didn't listen. I returned to my room, opened my laptop, and added my signature to the Bottom of the letter, Laura M. We sent it the next morning. The response came 2 days later. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It was direct, professional. They had received our files. They had reviewed our findings. They were interested in collaborating to publish a full public report. They asked if we were willing to participate in anonymized interviews. They asked if we had copies of the payment trails. They asked how many victims we had confirmed. Anna printed the email. We placed it on the board. That same day, Alex asked me what I had been working on. I didn't answer immediately. I opened one folder and left it on the kitchen table. I returned to my room. When I came back, he had read it. He didn't say anything. He didn't move the folder, but for the first time in weeks, he looked me in the eyes. He nodded once, small and uncertain. Then he asked if I wanted help finishing the last set of summaries. The morning the report was published, the campus was quiet. The sky was pale and washed out, a kind of cold light that didn't warm anything. I woke early. I hadn't slept much. I dressed without thinking, picked up my bag, and left the apartment. Before the street outside had filled with footsteps. The seminar room, Anna was already there. Her laptop was open. A cup of coffee sat untouched beside her. She was staring at the screen, her hands still, her expression unreadable. I sat beside her. The report had gone live. They had kept their promise. Every detail we had compiled had been cross-checked, verified, and laid out with precision. The structure was intact. Our names weren't included, only initials. The title was simple: A Case Study in Cross-Border Deception. Beneath it, page after page of facts, numbers, reconstructed platforms, and victim patterns. Maps, charts, currency trails. I scrolled through it slowly. I had seen every piece of it before, and yet, in this form, it felt new. As if our pain had finally taken shape, as if silence had become language. By noon, messages began to appear. The organization had tagged several official accounts in the release. A few journalists picked it up. One small news site published a summary article. Then another. Someone shared it on a subreddit dedicated to scam awareness. The page views climbed, quietly, steadily. We didn't speak. We didn't celebrate. We continued uploading new documents to the drive, adding new names to the timeline, and answering follow-up questions from the investigation team. A request came in asking if we would be willing to pass the full archive to law enforcement. Anna printed the form. We filled it out. In the days that followed, 2 of the websites we had tracked went offline. A few of the cryptocurrency wallets stopped receiving funds. The Telegram usernames we had linked to multiple scams vanished. New ones appeared. The system adapted, just like it always had. But something had changed. Now there was a record. Now, when someone searched for those names, for that site, for that method, they wouldn't find silence. They would find us. Alex began spending more time at his desk. He stayed up reading the report, studying the timeline, and tracing how each detail had fit together. He didn't talk about it much. He didn't try to reclaim his part in it. But he asked me once if I thought it would make a difference. I didn't answer. I just handed him another document to archive. The seminar room remained ours. We cleared the board, reorganized the folders, created a new section for updates and correspondence. We began receiving messages from people who had read the report and recognized their own stories inside it. Some offered thanks, some offered corrections, some offered more. One message stood out. A woman from Finland. She had never spoken about what happened to her, not even to her family, but after reading the report, she said she had cried, not because she was still in pain, but because someone else had carried part of her story without knowing her name. That night, I sat alone in the seminar room. The light from the window had dimmed into gray. The air smelled faintly of paper and dust. I opened my original folder, the one I had created months ago. The first notes, the first screenshots, the handwritten calculations. I closed it. I placed it in the archive box, sealed it, and slid it beneath the table. It didn't need to be open anymore. The damage had been done. The money was gone. The questions had no satisfying answers. But what remained was not just loss. It was work. It was the truth. It was the act of not disappearing. Anna stood at the doorway. She didn't enter. She didn't wave. She just waited. I stood. I turned off the light, and we walked out together. Days passed. Then weeks. The views on the report reached thousands. A few official inquiries were launched. An international committee requested access to the compiled dataset. Some payment processors initiated internal investigations. Nothing changed overnight. There were no dramatic headlines. But something had shifted quietly, like roots growing beneath the surface. The drive was still active. The updates came slower now. Fewer new cases. Fewer urgent messages. The network had stabilized. Some of the people we had helped were helping others. A quiet chain of support had begun. I visited the seminar room less often. I returned to my courses. The library became familiar again, not as a place of searching, but as a space of focus. I read things unrelated to fraud. I walked streets without scanning every billboard or flyer. I cooked for myself. I cleaned the apartment. I opened the windows. Alex moved out 3 weeks later. We didn't have a conversation. He packed his things. I helped him carry the boxes. He thanked me. I nodded. There was nothing left to say. His departure was not heavy. It was quiet, like most things between us had been. Anna and I kept in touch. We didn't meet as often, but sometimes she sent documents. Sometimes I sent updates. Our work didn't end. It only changed form. The report became a reference. It became a barrier, something standing between others and the silence we had once fallen into. One morning, I walked past the place where we had once sat together in the hallway, two strangers with folders in our laps and the weight of betrayal still fresh in our bones. The bench was empty now, but I smiled because I remembered how it started, and I knew how it ended, not with justice, not with all the money returned, but with the truth standing, quiet and unshaken, where the silence used to be, and that was enough. Thanks for listening to my story with me. Don't forget to subscribe and like for more scam stories.